This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. I'm Tom Keene, along with Jon Ferro and Lisa Abramowicz. Join us each day for insight from the best in economics, geopolitics, finance, and investment. Subscribe to Bloomberg Surveillance on Demand on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere you get your podcasts. And always on Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a joy. He is a National Security Council spokesman. He is someone steeped in our defense discussion as the president speaks at 1 p.m. this afternoon. But far more, Jon Kirby has actually had tours of duty with the Navy. He has real-world experience that when the facts change, Admiral Kirby changes. Admiral, thank you so much for joining us this morning. In your briefings with the president and his team this morning, what will be the message at 1 p.m.?
The first and most important message that the president will deliver in his remarks is really about the United States' long-standing and continued support of Israel, of the people of Israel. Our sympathies, obviously, with the loss and the suffering and the shock that they're going through, but also our firm resolve to make sure that they can continue to defend themselves against these terrorist attacks and to take action against Hamas directly. So he will talk about the military assistance that we are providing and that we expect to have to provide going forward. Number two, he'll talk about the hostage situation and the crisis and the fear that that is also engendering in so many hearts and minds throughout the region, including here in the United States, and what the United States might be willing to do to help with the hostage recovery efforts. And then lastly, and this is not unimportant at all, it's a strong message for Americans here at home that that anti-Semitism has no place, neither does terrorism, and that the United States federal government will work with state and local authorities to make sure that our Jewish community throughout the country doesn't have to live in fear and anguish and anxiety, that we're going to make sure that we can look after Jewish community centers and places of worship.
Jon Kirby, from an Israel template, there is 67 and 73, and they were very different. To bring it to your Navy, Admiral Zumwalt didn't have to worry about social media, the immediacy, the speed of news today. How will this effort of Israel and the assistance of the United States change because of this modern news cycle, the crushing visibility of the terror that we have seen?
Yeah, I mean, you can't have a conflict today anymore where it's not being brought home to people in real time, in micro bits of information and imagery, and it really gives you a gut punch because it's right in front of your face, and everywhere you turn, you gotta feel like you have to react to it. It is really important in a crisis like this, particularly when information is so ubiquitous and so accelerated that when appropriate, you got to make sure you're slowing down and making the right policy decisions, that you're acting not so much in reaction to what's in the news environment, but what you actually need to do on the field of battle or in the information space. Make no mistake. And we saw this in 2014 in the Gaza war. The information, the narrative war was just as important as the bombs that were dropping and the explosions that were going off. That will be even more the case here in terms of making sure that, that there is a common set of narratives about who's at fault here, who are the victims, and what needs to be done to move this forward.
Jon Kirby, there's been a lot of discussion around the $6 billion that the U.S. released unfroze, I should say, for Tehran. It has not been released yet. I've seen some of the comments that you and others have made in the administration saying that not a penny of it's actually been transferred. However, what is the discussion around refreezing it? How likely and realistic is it that this administration will refreeze that $6 billion?
We don't have a policy decision on that to speak to right now. It has always been the case that money could be frozen at any time. We said that when we sent it over to Qatar and made it available to the Iranians. It's also important to remember that the regime, even though none of it's been spent yet, but even if some had been, the regime never sees a dime of it. They never get their hands on it. It goes right to vendors that we approve, who buy the humanitarian goods and ship them into Iran for direct access to the Iranian people. The regime will never see a cent of this.
A lot of people have said that this is sort of just a distraction from the real issue, which is that essentially Iran is getting a ton of money through the exports of oil, particularly to China, despite sanctions, and the sanctions have been somewhat lightened. How much is the U.S. talking about enforcing the sanctions in a more significant way, or the ineffectiveness of those sanctions?
I would push back a little bit on the idea that sanctions have been lightened. We have not lightened any of the sanctions. In fact, we've added additional sanctions, some 400 sanctions on Iran just since the beginning of this administration. And we're absolutely committed to full and total enforcement. Now, obviously, other nations have to enforce their sanctions as well, and certainly we talk with them about that. But the United States has not backed off on any sanctions. Quite the contrary, we've added and increased our enforcement capability. Not to mention, we have increased our military presence in the Gulf region and now, of course, in the Eastern Med to deter would-be actors like Iran who might want to try to take advantage of this situation.
So far, there's been a distinction drawn by both U.S. and Israeli officials saying that while it is clear that Iran has been involved in backing Hamas financially, it is unclear whether they were directly involved in orchestrating this particular attack. What is the difference from a policy perspective? What would the U.S. do and Israel do should Iran be determined to have been intimately connected with orchestrating this attack?
I won't get into speculating about what policy decisions we might or might not make based on where the information and the intelligence leads us. All I can do is reiterate what we've been saying. We haven't seen any specific tactical intelligence or information evidence that points to Iran's participation in these particular attacks. Now, clearly, and we've made no bones about it, that there is already and has been for a long time a degree of complicity by Iran here because they've been supporting Hamas for many years. Training, capabilities, resourcing, certainly rhetorically in just the last 24 hours, the supreme leaders out there praising this attack by Hamas. So there's a degree of complicity, but we just haven't found any direct evidence. And quite frankly, neither have our Israeli counterparts.
Admiral Kirby, with great respect, and I don't want you to give away the family secrets, but the conventional effort is like a Boeing, the Sentry E-3 intelligence aircraft, where you put a couple of them up in the air and gather intelligence. This is 2 million people in a highly urban landscape squeezed into a geography that is 2 Washington, D.C.s. How do you prosecute intelligence against an enemy sandwiched in among 2 million people?
Very difficult to do. I won't speak for the Israelis. Of course, this is really for them to talk about. We will obviously and continue to share intelligence with them and offer them help in intelligence gathering. Of course we will. We always do. But it'll be a task really for them to work on. But it is very difficult, very dense, very, as you said, urban and very, very heavily populated. And Hamas, this is just another example of their barbarity, using Palestinians that live in Gaza as human shields, hiding in mosques and residential buildings and hospitals as command centers. I mean, this is what makes it very, very difficult for precise targeting.
Admiral, one final question, and I must speak to the Navy. The Gerald Ford is in the area. Is it properly staffed? Is this a U.S. Navy that can develop the manpower, the sea power to staff not only that aircraft carrier, but the many other ships involved?
Yeah, the Gerald Ford Carrier Strike Group is now in the Eastern Mediterranean. As you rightly said, it's not just the aircraft carrier and the embarked air wing of more than 80 aircraft, but it is several ships and around it in its periphery. They are all fully manned. They're all fully trained. They're all fully ready and fully armed to look after American national security interests in the region. That was one of the messages that the president wanted to send by moving those forces there, that nobody should take advantage of the situation in Israel, and that the United States will always make sure that our national security interests are first and foremost as well.
Admiral, thank you so much. Jon Kirby of the National Security Council. A different voice now, an important voice. Tzipi Hotovely, I'll get that right. Help me here, Lisa. Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom joins us this morning in her busy schedule as well. Ambassador, 6 years ago, in the conversation of the politics of Israel and the United States, you spoke about Jews in America leading convenient lives. I thought it was a brilliant comment of the distance of Israel from Judaism in America, speaking of convenient lives in America. Are our convenient lives, have they been shattered?
I think, in a way, every Jew in the world, his life's been shattered after what happened in the last 48 hours in Israel. I want to tell you from a personal stories because for me, I've been in Israel when the war started, and my husband and my two daughters are still in Israel. I just received my daughter's in a shelter at the moment because Tel Aviv is under rockets attack at the moment as we speak, and this is horrendous. We've never seen anything like that. And I'm speaking as someone who was experienced. I was part of the Israeli government. I've seen terror attacks in my life. And I must say this is unprecedented, the way Hamas barbarically acted against children, against young women. We're speaking here about war crimes being committed by Hamas. In the last 48 hours, the Israelis and the international community are exposed to those. I don't even have the words to explain how bad those atrocities are. And the videos on social media that I'm sure you've seen some of it. I've just seen the latest of a young Israeli child walking in Gaza and Palestinian children are beating him up. Those are things, I mean, think about it. It reminds us dark times in the Jewish history. And this is our obligation, our first obligation, to fight back and to make sure Hamas will never have the ability to act against Israelis.
Ambassador Tzipi Hotovely, how are you responding to the fact that this is really creating a whole host of tensions around the world that have become sort of ethnically focused on both sides? It really has erupted debates and protests and anger on both sides. How would you like to angle the conversation to be able to foster something more productive?
I think that this is time to fight and to defend the people of Israel. And I think whoever saw the fact that 1,000 Israelis were killed in cold blood cannot speak now about both sides. There is one side here who's the side that wants freedom, democracy, cares about human rights, cares about people's life, which is the Israeli side, and there is the other side. This is good versus evil. This is so clear here that we are fighting in one of Israel's darkest moments. We are fighting evil that the world haven't seen since the Second World War. And we need to fight it. It's a terror organization recognized in the US and in the UK. And, you know, many people are comparing to 9/11. And I heard many people that are making the equivalent numbers with the proportion. When you think about Israel as a tiny country, just 9 million people, it's actually 10 times of 9/11. And the disaster that the country is experiencing, this is something that any country in the world should support Israel now. We've seen Israeli flags here in London. We saw the British Parliament colors itself in blue and white. We saw number 10 Downing Street with a huge Israeli flag projected on. This is the time to support Israel. The international community should understand that if Israel is not protected, then the whole Western civilization is not protected, because those horrible things backed by Iran can happen everywhere.
Ambassador Hotovely, what do you make of some of the reports of Qatar, of the United Arab Emirates, of Egypt even acting as some sort of intermediary to negotiate hostage releases?
Hostage release is a very, very important mission at the moment. We call again Hamas to release every single individual, children, women, elderly women that were kidnapped by Hamas. Some of them were tortured, and we've seen horrible again videos and images that are coming from Gaza, and they are committing those war crimes, and the world must stop them to commit those war crimes. They need to release the people being kidnapped.
Ambassador, your politics is clearly to the right. That is the way it is established within the Israeli media and, of course, in the United Kingdom.
Let me help you with that.
Yeah.
I'm ambassador. According to the Israeli system, when you become a diplomat, you're representing the whole country.
That. Yes, of course.
I don't follow at the moment, the Israeli politics as a politician. I'm ambassador. I'm representing Israel.
Ambassador, I was talking to our Stuart Wallace about this news of a coalition or combined government within Israel. That is in your wheelhouse. Can that be successful? And how will a combination of Israeli politics be successful in prosecuting this war?
So first of all, it's clear both to the Prime Minister and to the leaders of opposition that there was never bigger necessity for a unity government in Israel than at this moment. And I speak on behalf of every Israeli. Israelis are united now. Israelis fight together, shoulder to shoulder. We see so many gestures coming from Israelis, want to support our soldiers, want to support the people that need help at the moment in Israel, that are in the front line. So they want to see the same reflection in our politics. And I'm sure that a unity government will happen and it will be the reality. Right. I hope sooner the better.
Ambassador, the Arab community speaks to different sets or different cohorts of Palestinians. Can the Arab nations assist Israel in speaking to Palestine away from Hamas?
You know, this is not something new. I mean, this is a process being going on over a generation. And in the last few years, as you know, there were dramatic breakthroughs between Israel and the Arab world with the Abraham Accords, with the ongoing negotiation with Saudi. So we are in times where the Arab world wants to be close to Israel and the Middle East is changing. Unfortunately, this radical ideology that Hamas is leading based on ISIS mentality, this jihadi ideology, look at Hamas charter, look at what they want to do. They want to kill basically every single Jew. They don't recognize the right of Israel to exist. So when this is Hamas ideology, this is ideology must be fight. You can't negotiate with these people. You can't have peace with Hamas. You need to fight back because they started this war and Israel will win this war.
Ambassador Hotovely, what do you make of some of the discussion around Iran? And there's been a lot of dancing around, you know, that they have backed Hamas, but that they weren't necessarily directly involved in executing it or orchestrating it. How important is that going to be, the determination of that, to determine the next step for the Israeli government?
Well, obviously, Iran is involved, and obviously, Iran is the big brain behind activating its proxies. But at the moment, we have this war to win. The war against Iran is something bigger than that, but the international community should know the real face of Iran and its proxies through those atrocities that Hamas committed in Israeli innocent people, including children and elderly. Can I say something? Just because my country is now in a point where almost 1,000 funerals are going to take place in the coming few days. This is a number we've never seen in our lifetime in one day. The president said yesterday that since the Holocaust, we never experienced a reality where so many Jews were killed in one day. And I'm looking at those stories. The Times has in the front page the Kedem family, Jonathan and Tamar, the beautiful twins, their son. They were all murdered in one day. Think about those families that were destroyed because of this barbaric attack. I think this is the day to mourn with the Israelis that lost their dear ones, their loved ones, those children being executed in front of their parents. Those are days to support Israel, and I think this is why I'm coming here to speak to you and all the people that care about the future of Western civilization. Israel is in the front line of this Western civilization, surrounded by very radical people, and we need to fight back, and we need the world's support in this very justified war. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining Bloomberg today. Ambassador Hotovely is Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom in our Queen Victoria Street studios.
With us around the table, Stuart Kaiser, head of US equity trading strategy over at Citi. Stuart, I've said this a few times already this week. We'd be waking up on Monday talking about the jobs report from Friday. The fact that the data's good and we're talking about something else. Can we just sit on the data for a moment? Good news for you and the team. You've said that a few times. It looked like it was on Friday.
Yeah, I think we're still in that camp. I was a little surprised by the response on Friday. I thought with the jobs number that was so strong, we might see bond volatility kind of hold equities back for a bit. It held them back for about 15 minutes, and then we kind of went back to normal operation. So as we sort of said, Friday encapsulated our view on how markets are going to respond to this data, which is if the data is very strong initially, you might get yields higher, and that can be a headwind for equities. But big picture, equities like a stronger economy, and you would expect them to kind of reorient to that as well. And I think both payrolls and the ISM report last week week, kind of played into that narrative.
Stuart, PepsiCo reports third quarter results, raises full year EPS, and provides initial constructive 2024 outlook. I'm going to go back to your phrase, which I love. It's a typical phrase you see from a guy like you. Solid growth. Okay, what does that mean? I mean, you are the optimist. People right now are scared stiff for 8 different reasons. Define solid.
I think for at this point, solid would be, you don't go into recession, right? You get an actual soft landing that doesn't include negative growth. From a jobs perspective, that's going to be, payrolls stay positive, unemployment rate stays below 4.5%, and you can get kind of a real soft landing. I think, your comments on Pepsi, I think the probably most important thing there is they're talking about 24, right? And, if corporate America has to do what the Fed did, which was basically revise up 2024, I think that's your bull case. If they remain very cautious on that growth, going into next year, then we probably have something to worry about.
And Lisa, this headline, I missed this within all the news flow we've got. PepsiCo still sees fiscal year organic revenue growth of 10%. I 3 years ago, I never envisioned that, not once. Double-digit revenue growth, that's stunning.
This is a reason why the idea of them revising their expectations upward, similar to the Fed, you think is good news. How important is JP Morgan and their earnings on Friday going to be in setting your expectations and setting your forecasts?
Yeah, the bank earnings in general, I think, are going to be very, very important. What do they do on reserves, again, will be important. How do they talk about the deal calendar, I think, is going to be incredibly important. And, we've had a lot of headlines recently on capital requirements. How they kind of message that, I think, will be important as well. Banks have been a really, really tricky sector. I think folks are frustrated that yields are rising and banks aren't performing as well. I think the deal calendar, I think the capital overhang, and the fact that the curve is still inverted, probably those 3 things are playing into this. And then there's just underlying credit risk where people are worried about on a go-forward basis.
Are you worried about credit risk? Or are you worried about the fact that so many companies are just holding on and not borrowing for as long as they possibly can because of what we're dealing with in terms of higher borrowing costs? Once they have to do that, then not only will you see credit distress, you will also see these banks have anemic deal flow on multiple levels.
Yeah, look, I think the credit thing's a little bit tricky. Everybody's worried about their ability to refinance, but if you look at the timing of it, a lot of it doesn't happen for a couple, 3 years. So we're getting really worked up about something that isn't really immediate. So I think from my perspective, what we're worried about is actually credit event type stuff. Do we see losses in the commercial real estate sector? Do we see companies have trouble either selling assets or refinancing that actually have to do it now? Unfortunately, when we tried to narrow that list, we got only about 25 stocks that really have near and dear type refinancing risk. So we're worried about it, but it does feel like maybe we're worried about it a little too early at this point.
You're saying that higher for longer isn't a problem anytime soon?
It would appear not, right? A lot of obviously the S&P is more of an investment grade corporate. A lot of those folks have refied and also locked in and extended. High yield borrowers, I think, tried to do that as well. So it is a risk. Obviously, some companies need to refi. It only takes one, right? It takes one company to have difficulty doing that, and then it can kind of snowball a bit. But if you look at the timing of their needs to refinance, it's not something that's really going to hit you in the next 6 to 12 months.
John, we talk about all this esoteric stuff. Mostly it comes down to you have to pick. Am I going to buy the potato chip company, or am I going to buy the good people from Atlanta? And, in every stock selection, you have to make a choice. Never did I think the choice would be this broad. Over the last decade, Pepsi has cleaned Coca-Cola's clock by what we call 355 basis points. That's 3.6% return per year.
So that's the potato chip company beating Atlanta.
Yeah.
Right?
Coke
right.
Zero is like,
it's a new way of framing
but
this.
In Stuart's world, this is how you keep your job, is you got to pick, Pepsi over Coke.
Yeah.
Coke, no Pepsi.
Okay. Got no idea where this is going now. Stuart, thank you.
That's a little dated from
Stuart Kaiser, Citi. Appreciate that.
Right now, and this is a great honor, Stephen A. Cook is Senior Fellow of Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. It's unfortunate that he and I speak only when the world is blowing up, or his world is blowing up. The definitive book on Turkey is False Dawn, and this June we will celebrate the end of ambition, how America should move forward in the Middle East. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to go to the ambition of the president this morning. He's going to speak here. We have to recalibrate an ambition with all the legacy of 48, 67, 73. What should be America's ambition day 4 of this war?
Well, it's clear that the president is going to throw all of his support to Israel. Already, there is actually bipartisan support for anything that the Israelis need. Resupply, they will need a resupply of Iron Dome interceptors. And there is an aircraft carrier battle group moving into the Eastern Mediterranean. That is clearly a warning to Iran and Hezbollah not to widen this conflict. That would be the nightmare scenario for the Israelis. So the United States is getting indirectly or directly involved, and I think it's an appropriate policy for the United States. The question will be, is as this conflict goes on, the Israelis are clearly gearing up for a major ground invasion, infantry in the Gaza Strip, occupation of the Gaza Strip for periods of time. How long will the international community remain staunchly behind Israel's operation? I think the Israelis have a lot of leeway with this president in particular, and after how many Israelis were killed in the opening stages of this conflict. But one can imagine, given the past pattern of events, as the Israelis prosecute their operations and more innocent Palestinians are killed, that there will be pressure for the Israelis to move off.
Stephen, to borrow from Mahan Abedin, is this an Iran resurgent? I mean, I look at Iran and I say, this is a complete surprise for so many of Hamas, but maybe also a complete surprise of Iran. Is it Iran resurgent?
Well, certainly Iran is playing the role of an agent of chaos in the region. I think the administration's efforts to modify Iranian behavior through diplomacy, through incentives, just does not work. And I think it should be clear to everybody by now that trying to engage the Iranians, trying to beget goodwill through goodwill, is not a fruitful avenue to pursue. The Iranians are not willing to reciprocate. They want to push the United States out of the region, and they want to confront Israel. And this is the result of it. And the sooner we all come to that conclusion, the better off we'll all be. We'll be clearer policies towards Iran will come into view.
Stephen, it feels like there is a feeling that Iran was involved. Yesterday, Jon was talking with Ron Dermer about this, about how as they get more information, they are realizing that maybe there was a more direct role from Iran. Is there just simply a reluctance to say it out loud? Because then it would necessitate a response that does escalate the conflict to such a degree that it puts it in dangerous territory?
I think that's exactly right. I think all the publicly available indicators would suggest that the Iranians were involved. The meetings between the Quds Force commander last spring and Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah, the kind of quantum leap in terms of tactics and complexity of the operation that began on Saturday has all the hallmarks of actually Hezbollah, Iran's primary proxy throughout the region. The unusual activity of the supreme leader on social media last week talking about the Zionist entity dying. And then, of course, Hamas itself thanking the Islamic Republic for its weaponry and support for the operation. If, though, the Israelis publicly pin the Iranians, it does call for direct engagement, kinetic action against the Iranians. Now, of course, the Israelis and the Iranians are engaged in a shadow war throughout the region anyway. But this would be a step up and a real confrontation. And one has to be sure that the United States and Israel are engaged in conversations about the what if here.
In your recent article, Stephen, in CFR, you wrote that under these circumstances, no foreign government, including the U.S., will have any leverage on Israel to respond with restraint. Where is the rest of the Middle East on this? We've heard about the United Arab Emirates. We've heard about Egypt. We've heard about Qatar trying to negotiate some sort of deal to release the hostages. Seems like that's a no-go based on both sides and some of the rhetoric there. What are people doing to try to prevent a full-out Middle East war that does involve a great deal of nations?
Well, there's not a lot that they can do. I think this is one of the problems is that publicly Arab governments have to issue these kind of statements that are run from ambiguous to condemnation of Israeli conduct. Now, Israelis, of course, have a lot to answer for their conduct in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip over many years. But of course, that's obviously no excuse for the butchery of innocents. So, in behind the scenes, they are seeking de-escalation. But of course, many of them remain on Israel's side here. So again, the Israelis will have a certain amount of leeway in order to prosecute this campaign. But of course, as the civilians suffer, there will in time be lots of pressure for the Israelis to back off. I think the Israeli public is demanding the destruction of Hamas, and that's going to give the Israelis further ability to resist international pressure that will come from both its neighbors as well as Europe. And some quarters in the United States as this operation continues.
Stephen, thank you for your insight this morning. Appreciate it. Stephen Cook there of the Council on Foreign Relations. Congressman Hill joins us right now. Congressman, a deeply emotional time for everyone involved, even those looking on from the outside looking in. Congressman, have you had an intelligence report, a briefing just yet?
Jonathan, we have a intelligence committee meeting on Israel this afternoon at 3 p.m. so that we can pose all these questions that so many of us have, which is, how did this happen and we weren't aware of it in advance? I think that's a key question that everybody's trying to get the right answer to.
There is something very odd about what we're being told currently from the administration. It was only a week or so ago that we heard from Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, who is optimistic about developments in the Middle East and said the Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades. At the same time, we've heard from Secretary Blinken, who said we've been concerned about the risks of instability for many, many months between Israelis and Palestinians. Congressman, which one was it?
I think it's, I've traveled in the region since the 1st of May. I've been in Amman twice, Jerusalem, Riyadh, Erbil, Baghdad, Ankara, Turkey, talking about the region, talking about the need for America's reassurance of the region that we're not pulling out and that we're a true partner. But there's some key issues. First, the Arab League has readmitted Assad back into the Arab League, even though he's done nothing to curtail his murder of his own citizens, his partnership with the Iranian Shia militia and the Russians in killing Syrians, and exporting Captagon, which is a deadly and addictive drug that he's manufacturing and selling to the Gulf states. And look, I was pleased that the president has begun to make progress with Saudi Arabia on potentially bringing them into the Abraham Accords initiated by President Trump. And for some of us, this looks like a direct response to that effort, that Iran is throwing a disruption by a full-scale attack, if we find it to be true that they backed Hamas. But they've been a financer of Hamas, they've been a founder of Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon. So all fingers are pointed in that direction, but we want to get the validation.
Congressman Hill, part of this is a stretch of 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, dare I say back to 1973, which is an America balancing between realpolitik and a focus, and some would say, critics would say, over-focus on human rights. Frame how that debate's going to go as you go to this security meeting this afternoon and, frankly, in the coming days of war.
Right. So, look, if you want peace in Israel, you've got to have a partner to negotiate with. And that's a really important thing, I think, for Americans to understand. There is no one Palestinian Authority that fully represents the citizens that live in Gaza and those in the West Bank. Hamas is essentially at political war with Fatah, which is Mahmoud Abbas's party in the West Bank. So it's very difficult to get a two-state solution when you don't really have two states that you're trying to negotiate with. That's why the Abraham Accords approach, the involvement of Saudi Arabia, I thought could be a breakthrough in trying to bring peace to the West Bank. But that doesn't really affect the fact that Hamas, which controls Gaza, doesn't agree with their other Palestinian brothers and sisters in the West Bank, and they're certainly fully committed to war with Israel.
Well, okay, the war with Israel, what do you expect to see at this meeting today? I mean, you've been in these meetings a zillion times as well. You're going to be briefed. Then what?
Well, I think we're going to find out first, what's the intelligence say about the partnership that helped Hamas carry out what was a surprise attack on Israel. So that's I think the first thing and the first and most important thing. Secondly, what is the response of Israel to that attack on their sovereign land, and what can the United States do to stand with our ironclad ally and partner in the region to repel it? And then, of course, we've got the issue, Tom, that's very concerning to all of us, which are Americans that are held as hostages or Americans that have been killed. And that will be a very important decision for the president, and I look forward to his assessment on what the American reaction should be to that.
Congressman, can the U.S. unleash aid to Israel without a House Speaker, without a functioning House?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Look, last 2 weeks ago, we passed the State and Foreign Operations appropriation across the House floor, and we passed the Defense Appropriation Bill across the House floor. Billions of dollars in those bills for our military partnership with Iran and to counter terrorism like Hamas, and money in state and foreign ops to enhance the Abraham Accords issue. And we don't support in these bills aid to the Palestinian Authority either until they rein in this kind of behavior. So those bills were important. I wish the Senate would take those up. But we need a House Speaker this week, and we need it soon because we want our full legislative body to have the voice of the American people. In case President Biden asks the House to take action this week, we have to have a House Speaker.
Congressman, are your peers, your colleagues in the House, in the Republican Party, willing to tie the idea of Ukraine aid and Israel aid together, or is there reluctance to really go for one and not the other, or simply to deal with this issue right now, given how politically fraught it is?
Yeah. Well, first, I think we should treat them separately personally. I'm working very hard in the House to find the consensus on the right path forward to support kicking Putin out of Ukraine and providing American support to our European allies to continue aid to Ukraine. We want transparency, we want leadership, we want a strategy to win, of course, but America is an indispensable partner in NATO and in that effort. Secondly, on Israel, we need to hear directly from the president after this, he completes his assessment on what we need to do to support our ally Israel that we can't do with existing authorities or existing funding. I think that remains to be seen, and we'll hear from them soon. In the meantime, as I say, we've appropriated $3.3 billion for foreign military sales assistance to Israel just 2 weeks ago, and we appropriated $500 million for the U.S.-Israeli military cooperation agreement. So there's significant money that's been approved by the House.
Congressman, speaking of money, this unfrozen $6 billion is getting a ton of attention. Let's work through it together. This is the official response from Secretary Blinken. This is what he says about it. Not a single dollar from that account has actually been spent to date. It's very carefully and closely regulated by the Treasury Department to make sure that it's only used for food, for medicine, for medical equipment. Are we focusing on the right thing here, Congressman?
Well, look, let's be clear. Let's say that Iran this year will have its largest GDP source, about $45 billion in oil sales. We're talking about releasing fungible money back to the government of Iran, which is a state sponsor of terrorism, about $6 billion related to money from oil sales to South Korea. What Secretary Blinken says is true, that it can only be released when they make a humanitarian or food assistance purchase, but it's still money that goes into the Treasury in Tehran, and they can use other money to fund terrorism because they know that $6 billion is coming in. And on top of that, Iraq owes Iran $31 billion, and the United States has approved a release of about $2 or almost $3 billion of natural gas sales money from Iraq to Iran. So this is significant money when you think about their largest GDP revenue source is about $45 billion, and we're talking roughly $17 billion in total that they're eligible to receive through these trust accounts, as you say, for a humanitarian or foodstuff type purchase. But we're not naive here. That frees up other money in the Tehran treasury.
French, thanks for catching up with us today. I know the intelligence briefing is a little bit later on this afternoon. We'd love to catch up with you again afterwards to get an idea of what you've heard from the government. Congressman French Hill there.
Subscribe to the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live every weekday starting at 7 a.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can watch us live on Bloomberg Television and always on the Bloomberg Terminal. Thanks for listening. I'm Tom Keene, and this is Bloomberg.